November 19th, 1943. U-538 cut through the cold Atlantic swells, her diesel engines thrumming as Kapitänleutnant Johann Heinrich Oskar pushed her northwest toward the convoy routes. 27 days into patrol. Fuel running low, 2 merchants sunk, not enough, never enough anymore. Oskar stood in the conning tower, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the horizon. The mathematics of this war had changed, and every U-boat commander in the Kriegsmarine knew it. They just didn't talk about it. You sank a freighter, 10,000 tons, maybe, and felt that brief surge of victory. Then came the radio reports. 3 new American ships launched yesterday, 5 the day before, 7 today. The numbers made no sense. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The war had taught Oskar to trust mathematics, fuel consumption rates, torpedo spread calculations, the cold arithmetic of tonnage versus time. But these new numbers from America defied every principle of naval architecture he'd ever learned. You couldn't build ships that fast. The Kriegsmarine's own shipyards in Hamburg and Kiel needed months to construct a single vessel. The British yards, battered by bombing, struggled to replace losses. But the Americans? The Americans were doing something that shouldn't be possible. In his jacket pocket, Oskar carried a worn piece of paper. Intelligence summary from U-boat headquarters in Berlin. Dated May 7th, 1943. The Americans, it said, were now completing 1 merchant ship every 8 hours, 3 per day, every single day. The report estimated that by year's end they would have built over 2,000 of these vessels. 2,000. The entire Kriegsmarine had started the war with 57 U-boats. Oskar did the mental arithmetic compulsively during the long hours on watch. His boat had sunk. 11 Allied ships since 1941. Good numbers, better than most. But if the Americans were building ships faster than the entire U-boat fleet could sink them, what was the point? You couldn't win a tonnage war against an opponent who treated 10,000-ton cargo vessels as disposable. The helmsman's voice cut through his thoughts. Smoke on the horizon, bearing 040. Oskar swung his binoculars. A thin dark line against the grey sky. Could be anything. Could be salvation, when, a straggler from a convoy, easy prey. Could be death, an escort vessel hunting for exactly this kind of opportunity. He ordered the approach, keeping the boat at periscope depth, moving slowly. The war had killed all the impatient U-boat commanders by now. Those who survived had learned caution, learned to weigh every decision against the growing power of Allied air cover, radar, sonar, depth charges. The smoke resolved into a ship, single vessel, no escorts visible, moving at perhaps 11 knots, slow, painfully slow by any reasonable standard. Oskar felt his pulse quicken. This was the opportunity every commander prayed for. Alone, vulnerable, perfect. Through the periscope, he studied the target. Ugly thing, boxy superstructure, blunt bow. This vessel looked like something assembled from prefabricated pieces, which, according to intelligence reports, was exactly what it was. The Americans called them Liberty ships. Admiral Dönitz called them coffins. But Oskar saw something else in that ungainly profile. He saw the future losing, because that ship, Ugly, slow, ugly, barely seaworthy by peacetime standards, Ugly, represented something the Kriegsmarine couldn't match: industrial capacity, the ability to overwhelm quality with quantity, to accept losses that would cripple any traditional navy and simply build more ships, faster, cheaper, without pause. The Liberty ship carried, according to the intelligence, briefs, approximately 10,000 tons of cargo, jeeps maybe, tanks, ammunition, food, medicine, all the materials needed to keep Britain fighting, to feed the Soviet Union, to prepare for the invasion everyone knew was coming. Sink it, and you denied the enemy those supplies, for perhaps 3 days, because 3 days from now, the Americans would launch 3 more ships to replace it. Oskar gave the order to fire. The torpedo left the tube with that familiar thump that resonated through the boat's hull. 40 seconds to target. He counted them. The crew counted them. Everyone counted them, because in those 40 seconds anything could happen. The torpedo could malfunction. The target could turn. Escort vessels could appear from nowhere. The explosion lit the grey afternoon with orange fire. Direct hit, amidships, right where the cargo holds were deepest. The Liberty ship shuddered, listed immediately to port. Oskar watched through the periscope as men scrambled across the deck, launching lifeboats, jumping into the freezing Atlantic water. He should have felt triumph. Another kill. More tonnage subtracted from Allied shipping. But instead, he felt something close to despair. Because 3 days ago, while he was hunting this one ship, American yards on the west coast had launched the USS John Burke, the USS George Washington, and the USS Benjamin Franklin. 3 Liberty ships, 10,000 tons each, 30,000 tons of new shipping to replace the 10,000 tons now sinking beneath the waves. The mathematics were brutally simple. To win the tonnage war, U-boats needed to sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. In 1942, that had almost been possible. U-boats had sunk over 6 million tons of shipping, staggering numbers that should have brought Britain to its knees. But in that same year, American shipyards alone had produced over 5 million tons of new merchant vessels, and production was accelerating. By 1943, monthly output had doubled, then tripled. The Americans were building ships at a rate that would have seemed like fantasy just years earlier. Oskar ordered the dive. Deep, fast, away from the scene before aircraft arrived. The Allies had started equipping their aircraft with better radar, better depth charges. Staying near a sinking ship was suicide now. Hit and run, kill and flee. That was the new doctrine. As U-538 descended into the dark Atlantic waters, Oskar thought about the numbers again. The Kriegsmarine had lost 41 U-boats in May alone. 41 boats and their crews, 25% of operational strength, gone in 1 month. They called it Black May in the debriefing rooms. The month the tonnage war was lost, because while those 41 boats were being destroyed, the Americans had launched 384 new merchant ships. 384. The ratio was beyond comprehension. For every U-boat sent to the bottom, the Allies gained 9 new ships. No navy in history had ever faced mathematics like that. The story of how this happened began not in the Atlantic, but in the shipyards of California and Maine and North Carolina. It began with a man named Henry Kaiser, who knew nothing about building ships but understood everything about mass production. It began with British desperation and American industrial genius, and it began with a simple, brutal recognition that in modern war, quantity had a quality all its own. In Hamburg, Admiral Karl Dönitz stood before a wall covered in charts and graphs. Position plots for every U-boat at sea, tonnage figures for Allied shipping sunk, production estimates for both new U-boats and enemy merchant vessels. The mathematics of naval warfare reduced to lines on paper. Dönitz was 52 years old, a veteran of submarine warfare since the First World War. He understood boats, understood tactics, understood the cold calculations that governed war at sea. It had built the U-boat arm from virtually nothing after Hitler's rise to power, had developed the Wolfpack tactics that had brought the British to the edge of starvation, had turned the Atlantic into what he called the graveyard of shipping. But now, in November of 1943, even Dönitz couldn't escape the numbers. His aide placed another report on the desk. American production figures for October. 128 Liberty ships completed. 128. In a single month. More ships than Germany had built in the entire year of 1942? How is this possible? Dönitz asked, though he already knew the answer. His intelligence officers had provided detailed reports, photographs of American shipyards taken by long-range reconnaissance aircraft, descriptions from agents, the whole impossible process. The Americans had reinvented shipbuilding. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. Instead of constructing vessels from keel to superstructure in shipyards, they manufactured ships in pieces: hull sections, deck sections, entire engine rooms, all prefabricated in factories across the United States, then transported to shipyards where they were welded together, like assembling automobiles, like building toys. The first Liberty ship had taken 244 days to complete. By 1943, the average was 42 days. 42 days from laying the keel to launching. Some yards had gotten it down to 30 days. One publicity stunt had assembled a ship in less than 5 days, though that was more theatre than production standard. Still, 42 days. The Germans needed 6 months minimum for a merchant vessel. The British needed even longer, working with damaged facilities and scarce materials. Dönitz studied the production curves. By the end of 1943, the Americans would have built approximately 1,800 Liberty ships, 1,800. The number seemed abstract, meaningless. No one could visualize 1,800 ships. But Dönitz could visualize what they represented: defeat. Because here was the calculation that mattered. To starve Britain, to prevent the build-up for invasion, U-boats needed to sink approximately 800,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, every month, consistently, for years if necessary. In the first years of war, they had achieved that. In 1942, monthly averages had exceeded the target. Britain's food stocks had dwindled. Fuel rationing had become severe. The strategy was working. Then came May 1943. Black May. 41 U-boats lost, nearly 2,000 submariners killed or captured, and for that catastrophic price, they had sunk only 284,000 tons of Allied shipping, 1/3 of what was needed, 1/10 of what the Americans alone were producing. Dönitz had ordered the withdrawal on May 24th, pulled the boats back from the North Atlantic convoy routes, admitted, for the first time, that the U-boat arm could not achieve its strategic objectives. The tonnage war was lost, but the killing continued. Because wars don't end when the strategic math says they should. Wars end when the blood finally runs out. The Liberty ship was born from British desperation. In 1940, after the fall of France, Britain faced maritime starvation. German U-boats and surface raiders were sinking merchant ships faster than British yards could replace them. The island nation imported over 70% of its food. Without ships, Britain would starve before German troops ever landed. The British had designed a simple, cheap cargo ship based on a 19th-century tramp steamer design. Nothing fancy, just a floating box with a steam engine. Basic enough that even inexperienced shipyards could build them. Britain ordered 60 from American yards under a cash-and-carry arrangement. Then President Roosevelt looked at the design and saw something else. Saw possibility. Saw America's path to victory without initially committing combat troops. In January 1941, he announced the expansion of the program: 200 ships, then 400. Then the numbers stopped meaning anything because the program had become unlimited. The Maritime Commission modified the British design, made it even simpler, replaced riveting with welding, which was faster and required less skilled labour. Standardized every component so that parts from one shipyard would fit vessels built in another, created detailed blueprints so precise that workers with minimal training could follow them. They called the design EC2, Emergency Cargo, Type 2. Roosevelt saw the first one and reportedly said it looked like an ugly duckling. The name stuck. But ugly ducklings could swim, could carry cargo, could cross oceans. That was enough. Henry Kaiser made them fly. Kaiser was 59 in 1941, an industrialist who had built dams and roads but never a ship. He understood mass production, had studied Ford's automobile assembly lines, believed that shipbuilding's craft tradition, skilled workers building unique vessels, was obsolete. Ships could be manufactured like cars, like refrigerators. Like any other industrial product, the old shipbuilders laughed at him, said it couldn't be done, said ships were too complex, too individualized, Said welding would create weak points. Said you needed years of experience to build vessels properly. Kaiser ignored them. Built enormous shipyards in Richmond, California. Hired workers from everywhere. Farmers, housewives, students, anyone willing to learn. Trained them in weeks. Set up assembly lines where each work crew did one repetitive task. Perfected prefabrication where entire ship sections were built away from the shipyard, then delivered by rail. The first Kaiser-built Liberty ship took 90 days. The second took 75. The third took 60. By late 1942, Richmond Shipyard No. 2 was launching a new Liberty ship every 14 days per slipway, and they had 7 slipways. The USS Robert E. Peary set the record that became legendary. Keel laid November 8, 1942. Ship launched November 12. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes from start to finish. It was a publicity stunt, yes. Much of the fitting-out work happened after launch. But the point was made. Americans could build ships faster than anyone had imagined possible. By 1943, 3 Liberty ships were being launched every single day, every 24 hours. 1 every 8 hours. The ships were not beautiful. Merchant sailors called them ugly, called them the worst sea boats ever built. They rolled in any weather. The engines were underpowered, maxing out at 11 knots. The welded hulls sometimes cracked in cold North Atlantic water. Several broke completely in half during storms. But they floated. They carried cargo. They crossed oceans. And there were thousands of them. Each Liberty ship could carry 10,000 tons of cargo, could transport 2,500 jeeps, or 440 tanks, or 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition. The holds could be configured for troops, though the accommodations were miserable. Could carry locomotives, aircraft in crates, grain, oil, medical supplies, everything an army needed, packed into a floating warehouse. The average Liberty ship cost less than $2 million. Compare that to a single B-17 bomber, which cost over $200,000. For the price of 10 bombers, America got a ship that could carry an entire armored division's equipment across the Atlantic, and the Americans built them by the hundreds. German intelligence officers compiled the reports. Photographs of American shipyards showed forests of construction cranes, acres of hull sections, assembly lines that stretched for miles. The reports seemed like propaganda at first. No one could build ships at this scale. It violated every principle of naval architecture. But the ships kept appearing, in convoys, dozens at a time. Plain, ugly, slow, absolutely unstoppable because they came in waves that never ended. By mid-1943, the Kriegsmarine had a clearer picture. 18 shipyards, 7 in California, 3 in Maine, 2 in North Carolina, plus others scattered across the East Coast and Gulf. Together, these yards were launching over 100 Liberty ships per month. Donitz read the reports with growing horror. His best U-boat commanders were sinking perhaps 5 or 6 merchant ships per patrol, if they were lucky and survived. Call it 15 ships per month for the most successful boats. But there were only about 100 U-boats operational at sea at any given time. The arithmetic was devastating. Even if every single U-boat at sea sank 5 ships per month, an impossibly high average, the total would be 500 ships. The Americans alone were producing over 100 Liberty ships monthly, plus tankers, plus Victory ships, plus warships. British yards were still building. Canadian yards contributed. The Allies were replacing losses and expanding their merchant fleet simultaneously. You couldn't win a war against arithmetic like that. The human cost told an even darker story. Each U-boat carried a crew of approximately 50 men. When a U-boat was sunk, EI, and by 1943 they were being sunk regularly, all 50 usually died. The survival rate from U-boat sinkings was perhaps 10%, maybe. In May 1943 alone, over 1,800 German submariners died. 1,800 men, most of them in their 20s, trapped in steel coffins as depth charges crushed the hull or aircraft rockets tore through the pressure vessel. Some drowned when compartments flooded. Some died from pressure trauma when the boat went too deep. Some suffocated when the oxygen ran out. The U-boat service had approximately 40,000 men throughout the war. Over 30,000 of them died, a 75% casualty rate. No branch of any military in the war suffered losses like that and continued fighting. But they did continue. Because the mathematics of war aren't just about ships and tonnage. They're about will, about determination, about young men who climbed into submarines knowing the odds, knowing how many boats never returned, knowing that every patrol might be their last. And they're about the equally young Americans who welded those ships together, who sailed them across submarine-infested waters, who understood that their ugly, slow, poorly designed vessels were somehow winning the war by simply existing in vast numbers. The Liberty Ship program would ultimately produce 2,710 vessels between 1941 and 1945, 2,710 floating warehouses, each carrying supplies that kept armies fighting and populations fed. The U-boat arm sank approximately 200 of them, 200 out of 2,700, less than 8%. Those 200 sinkings cost thousands of tons of supplies, hundreds of lives, but the other 2,500 ships completed their missions, carried their cargo, delivered the materials that fed Britain, armed the Soviet Union, supplied the invasion of Europe, sustained the war effort across 2 oceans. The mathematics of industrial war had spoken, and the verdict was final. March 7, 1942. The USS Patrick Henry steamed through the Denmark Strait, her cargo holds packed with crated aircraft destined for Britain. She was the first Liberty ship ever built, launched back in September 1941, and she had already completed 3 Atlantic crossings. Each time, her crew expected torpedoes. Each time, somehow, she made it through. The armed guard commander, a 23-year-old Navy ensign named Robert Mercer, stood on the bridge wing watching the grey water. His defensive armament consisted of 1 4-inch gun mounted on the stern, several 20mm anti-aircraft cannons, and a crew of 28 gunners. Against a surfaced U-boat at close range, they might stand a chance. Against a submerged attack, they were helpless. The merchant crew numbered 41 men. Most had never been to sea before 1941. The captain was a former Great Lakes freighter skipper who had learned navigation on calm inland waters. The chief engineer had worked in a power plant. The radio operator had been a small-town telephone repairman. They were amateurs sailing a ship built by amateurs, carrying cargo assembled by workers who had been farmers and housewives months earlier. Everything about the Liberty Ship program defied professional maritime tradition. Everything about it should have failed. But it worked. Because, in total war, competence matters less than capacity, and America had capacity to spare. The convoy numbered 42 ships, mostly Liberty ships, a few British merchantmen, several tankers. The escort consisted of 2 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and a handful of converted yachts pressed into service as patrol vessels. Against a wolf pack of 20 U-boats, the escort would have been overwhelmed, but the wolf packs weren't finding convoys as easily anymore. Allied code breakers had penetrated the German Enigma cipher, not completely, not consistently, but enough to route convoys around known U-boat positions, enough to tip the balance. The Germans suspected compromise but couldn't prove it, and even if they had known for certain, what could they do? Change codes, yes, but the mathematics of the Atlantic remained unchanged. Too many ships to sink, too few U-boats to sink them. Mercer had studied the intelligence briefings, knew the numbers. In 1942, U-boats had sunk approximately 1,200 Allied ships, staggering losses. But in that same year, Allied yards had built 1,400 new vessels. The merchant fleet was growing despite the slaughter. The convoy zigzagged according to a preset pattern designed to complicate torpedo solutions. Every few hours, all ships turned simultaneously, presenting different angles to any watching periscope. It made the crossing slower, but it kept submarines guessing about course and speed. On the third day out, the lookout spotted a periscope. Just a glimpse, 800 yards off the port beam. The convoy alarm sounded. Ships turned away. Escorts raced toward the contact, depth charges ready. But the U-boat had already dived deep, running silent. The destroyer dropped a pattern of depth charges. Huge geysers of water erupted astern. For 10 minutes, the escorts hunted, using sonar that was barely more sophisticated than listening for engine noise. Then they gave up, returned to the convoy. Either the U-boat was destroyed, or it had escaped, no way to know. Mark it as probable damage and move on. The Patrick Henry continued toward Britain, and 3 days later, at the Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California, workers launched the USS Zebulon Pike, another Liberty ship. Another 10,000 tons of cargo capacity added to the Allied merchant fleet. The cycle continued. In the shipyards, the work never stopped, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Welders worked in shifts, their arc lights creating a perpetual false daylight. Cranes swung hull sections weighing 30 tons, as if they were toys. Railroad cars delivered prefabricated components from factories hundreds of miles away. Everything timed, everything coordinated, everything moving toward one goal: more ships, faster. The workers were as unlikely as the ships they built. Women made up nearly 30% of the workforce at some yards. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. She was real, welding hull plates and operating cranes and doing work that had been considered exclusively male just years earlier. African Americans found employment in the shipyards after decades of exclusion from most industrial jobs. Pay was good, $60 a week for an experienced welder, more than many had ever earned. The yards drew workers from across the country, farmers from the Midwest, coal miners from Appalachia, Dust Bowl refugees from Oklahoma, all converging on shipyards that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Kaiser's Richmond yards employed over 90,000 workers at peak production. The noise was constant: hammering, welding, riveting, the scream of metal cutting through metal. The yards ran 3 shifts. When one crew went home, another arrived. The ships never stopped growing. Each Liberty ship was divided into approximately 250 prefabricated sections. The bow section, weighing over 100 tons, came from one factory, the stern section from another. Deck sections, bulkheads, even the deck houses were built elsewhere, then transported to the shipyard. Assembly happened on slipways angled toward the water. Workers welded the sections together in sequence, starting with the keel and working upward. The welding alone required nearly 50 miles of welds per ship. Every weld had to be tested for strength. Weak welds meant cracks. Cracks meant ships breaking apart in heavy seas. In the first year, quality control was a nightmare. Some ships did break apart. The SS Schenectady literally split in two while docked in calm water in January 1943. The entire hull cracked from deck to keel, the two halves separating like something out of a disaster film. Investigation revealed brittle steel, combined with cold temperatures and poor welding technique. The Maritime Commission responded with improved specifications, better steel grades, revised welding procedures, addition of riveted crack arresters along the hull to prevent cracks from propagating. The modifications reduced catastrophic failures significantly, but Liberty ships remained vulnerable in harsh conditions. Sailors learned which routes to avoid during winter months when cold water made the steel brittle. Despite the problems, production accelerated. By mid-1943, Kaiser's yards alone were launching one Liberty ship every 4.5 days. The Richmond yards had 7 slipways. Simple math: 7 ships under construction simultaneously, each taking roughly 30 days from keel laying to launch. Result: 1 launch every 4 days. Multiply that across 18 shipyards nationwide. The numbers became astronomical. 128 ships in November 1943, 131 in December. The production curve was still climbing. Each completed ship needed a crew. The Merchant Marine recruited aggressively, signed up anyone willing to face U-boats for combat pay. Some recruits had maritime experience, most didn't. They learned on the job, learned to fire the defensive guns during aircraft attacks, learned to swim in cold water after torpedoes hit, learned that the survival rate from a merchant ship sinking was better than from a submarine, but not by much. 9,000 merchant mariners died during the war, torpedoed, bombed, lost in storms. The casualty rate per capita exceeded that of every military branch except the submarines they were fighting against. But the ships kept sailing, because the alternative was losing the war. In Britain, the arrival of each convoy was documented meticulously. Port workers tallied the cargo, tanks counted and distributed to armoured divisions, aircraft uncrated and flown to airfields, ammunition stored in depots, food rationed to a population that had been on the edge of starvation in 1941. British civilians could see the difference. Rations increased slightly. Not to pre-war levels, never that, but enough. Enough to keep working, enough to sustain morale, enough to believe that holding out was possible. The Liberty ships made that possible. Each arrival represented £50 million of food, or 300 tanks, or 10,000 tons of ammunition. Multiply by dozens of ships per convoy, multiply by dozens of convoys per year. The arithmetic of survival. Soviet Russia received similar support. The Murmansk convoys ran through some of the most dangerous waters in the war. German bases in Norway positioned U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft perfectly to intercept convoys heading to Soviet ports. The losses were catastrophic. Some convoys lost over half their ships, but enough got through. Enough Liberty ships delivered their cargo to Murmansk and Archangel. Enough American tanks reached Soviet crews. Enough trucks gave the Red Army mobility. Enough food kept Soviet soldiers fighting. Stalin never acknowledged the debt publicly, but his generals knew. The Soviet Union produced excellent tanks and artillery, but logistics had always been problematic. American trucks, tens of thousands of them, delivered by Liberty ships, gave Soviet forces the mobility to exploit breakthroughs. American food supplements kept Soviet soldiers fed during brutal winters. American material support didn't win the Eastern Front, but it made victory possible. Back in the Atlantic, U-538 continued her patrol. Captain Lieutenant Oskar had sunk one more merchant ship since the Liberty ship in November. 2 kills in 40 days at sea. Not good numbers. Not enough to justify the fuel expenditure, the torpedo expenditure, the risk. The changed Atlantic environment was obvious to every U-boat commander. Allied aircraft appeared everywhere now. Long-range liberators equipped with radar that could detect surfaced submarines in darkness or fog. The U-boats couldn't run on the surface anymore to recharge batteries and ventilate the hull. They spent more time submerged, which reduced their effective range and made them slower than the convoys they were hunting. Escort vessels had improved too. Better sonar, better depth charges that exploded at precisely calculated depths. Hedgehog projectiles that threw patterns of small explosives ahead of attacking ships. One hit from a Hedgehog would hole a submarine's pressure hull. Game over. The escorts worked in teams now. One ship would make contact with sonar, others would maneuver to attack from multiple angles. While the U-boat was evading one attacker, another closed in. Coordinated assault, professional, deadly. Oskar had lost friends. U-223, commanded by his academy classmate Hans Wechter, disappeared in October. U-640, under Klaus Hartmann, sunk by aircraft in the Bay of Biscay. U-338, lost with all hands after a convoy battle. The list grew longer each month, and for what? To sink ships that were replaced within days, to fight a tonnage war that the mathematics said was already lost, to die in steel coffins at the bottom of the Atlantic for a cause that every rational analysis showed was doomed. But U-538 stayed on station, kept hunting, kept hoping for that lucky encounter with an undefended straggler, because submarine commanders don't give up, can't give up. That's not how it works. December 8, 1943. Contact. Radio report from U-415. Large convoy spotted. Course 260, speed 8 knots. Position transmitted. Oskar calculated the intercept. 16 hours at maximum surface speed. Risky, long time exposed to aircraft. But this might be the opportunity that redeemed the entire patrol. U-538 ran on the surface through the night. Oskar kept constant lookout for aircraft. The sky remained clear. Maybe luck was finally turning. Maybe this convoy would be poorly defended. Maybe the mathematics of war would favor him for once. Dawn revealed the convoy. 40 ships, maybe more. Mostly Liberty ships from the silhouettes. Escorts visible on the perimeter. Standard formation. Nothing extraordinary. Except the sheer number of targets. Oskar studied the formation through his binoculars. Calculated angles. Convoy speed looked like 10 knots, faster than expected. The Liberty ships usually cruised at 11 maximum, so the convoy must be pushing hard. Trying to outrun submarines rather than wait for them to attack, he submerged to periscope depth, approached slowly, carefully. The escorts were pinging with sonar, but inconsistently. He could slip between the patrols if timing was right. Get close enough for a spread of torpedoes. Multiple targets, multiple kills. The convoy's scale impressed him despite himself. 40 ships, 400,000 tons of cargo. Enough material to supply an army for weeks. Enough food to feed millions. All of it moving across the Atlantic in one vulnerable concentration, but also defended. The escorts knew their business. Coordinated movements, overlapping sonar coverage. The convoy didn't zigzag as much as earlier formations had. Maybe they'd learned that speed was better defense than evasion. Make the U-boats chase, exhaust their battery power trying to catch up. Oskar selected his target. A Liberty ship in the third column, position that offered a slight angle on 2 other ships. Fire 3 torpedoes in spread pattern, maybe get 2 hits, maybe 3 if luck held. He gave the order. 3 torpedoes away, then immediate dive, deep, fast. Before the escorts could triangulate the launch position, the first torpedo hit. Explosion felt through the hull even at depth. The second hit seconds later. Different ship or same one? No way to tell while running deep. The third torpedo might have missed or malfunctioned. Oskar didn't wait to find out. Depth charges began falling. Distant thunder at first, then closer. The hull creaked under pressure. Light bulbs shattered. Men held on to whatever was bolted down. This was the cost of success. You hit them, they hit you back. The escorts knew roughly where you were. Now came the hunt. For 6 hours, U-538 ran silent. All unnecessary equipment shut down. Crew barely breathing, listening to the escorts above, tracking their movements by sound, adjusting depth and course to evade. The battery drained steadily. Oxygen levels dropped. Carbon dioxide built up. Finally, the escorts moved away, back to the convoy. They couldn't spend all day hunting one submarine when 40 ships needed protection. Oskar waited another hour, then carefully ascended to periscope depth. The convoy was gone. 2 oil slicks marked where his torpedoes had struck. Maybe he'd sunk 2 ships, maybe only damaged them. No way to confirm. He couldn't surface to investigate. Too dangerous. Mark it as probable kills and move on. That's all any U-boat commander could do. U-538 headed home. Fuel almost gone. All torpedoes expended. 1 confirmed kill, maybe 2. 6 weeks at sea for 2 ships. The arithmetic still didn't work. Continuing Part 2. In Berlin, Admiral Dönitz reviewed the monthly loss reports. December 1943. 28 U-boats lost. 800 submariners dead or missing. And Allied shipping losses, 342,000 tons. Less than half what was needed to maintain strategic pressure. Meanwhile, American yards had launched 119 new Liberty ships in December alone. 119 ships totaling over 1 million tons of new cargo capacity. In 1 month, more than all U-boat sinkings combined for the entire quarter, the numbers had become obscene. Dönitz spread the charts across his desk, searching for some angle, some tactical adjustment that might change the equation. Deploy U-boats to different hunting grounds? The Allies had shipping everywhere. Change tactics to target escorts instead of merchants? That just reduced tonnage sunk without preventing convoy deliveries. The fundamental problem was production. Germany's entire war economy struggled to build U-boats fast enough to replace losses. The shipyards at Selve, Hamburg, Kiel, and Bremen worked at capacity. New submarine construction averaged 20 boats per month. Good numbers, respectable output. But the Allies were destroying 30 U-boats per month on average. The submarine fleet was shrinking despite maximum production effort. And even if U-boat numbers had remained stable, the merchant ship advantage was overwhelming. The Allies had more cargo capacity in January 1944 than they'd had in January 1943, despite 2 years of submarine warfare. You couldn't win against those numbers. Couldn't intimidate, couldn't threaten, couldn't force surrender through attrition when the enemy's capacity to absorb losses exceeded your capacity to inflict them. The Liberty ship program represented something new in warfare, not just mass production, though that was revolutionary enough, but the willingness to accept mediocrity in individual vessels in exchange for overwhelming numerical advantage. The ships weren't particularly good, slow, uncomfortable, prone to structural problems. In peacetime, no shipping company would have accepted them, but in wartime, good enough was more valuable than perfect. A ship that took 42 days to build was more useful than a ship that took 6 months, even if the slower-built ship was objectively superior, because the faster ship would be making its 5th voyage before the slower ship even launched. Quantity, Dönitz realized, had become a quality of its own, not in individual combat. One U-boat could sink one Liberty ship easily enough, but strategically, over months and years, the side that could field more units would eventually overwhelm the side with better individual units. Simple math, brutal math, inescapable math. The Germans had understood this in ground warfare. That's why they'd invaded Russia with 3 million men. Overwhelm through numbers. Accept losses. Keep pushing until the enemy broke. Blitzkrieg relied on concentrated force, but the force had to be large enough to achieve breakthrough. But at sea, Germany had never possessed numerical advantage. The U-boat fleet had started small and grown steadily, but never large enough to truly dominate the Atlantic. 57 boats in 1939, 240 boats at peak strength in mid-1943. Sounds impressive until you remember the Atlantic Ocean is vast. Most U-boats at any given time were in transit, refueling, or undergoing repairs. Operational strength at sea rarely exceeded 100 boats. 100 submarines trying to interdict shipping across an ocean the size of North America. The early successes had happened because Allied defences were weak, not because U-boat numbers were strong. Once the Allies organised proper convoy systems and dedicated sufficient escorts, the submarine advantage evaporated. And then came the Liberty ships, waves of them. Endless production that turned the tonnage war into a joke. You could sink 10 merchant ships and feel like you'd accomplished something, until intelligence reported that the Americans had launched 30 ships the same week you sank those 10. Dönitz picked up a photograph from his desk, a Liberty ship photographed by reconnaissance aircraft. The image showed a standard merchant vessel, nothing remarkable, but written on the back was a notation, SS James Woodrow, launched Kaiser Richmond Yard No. 3, October 27, 1943. 31 days construction time. 31 days. From bare steel to completed ship in 31 days, the German yard at Hamburg needed 18 weeks minimum. The British needed longer. But the Americans had turned shipbuilding into manufacturing, treated ocean-going vessels like consumer products, mass-produced merchant ships the way they mass-produced automobiles. And it had worked. The strategy that shouldn't have been possible, that violated every traditional principle of naval architecture, had succeeded because the Americans had ignored tradition and focused only on results. By January 1944, over 1,800 Liberty ships were in service. 1,800. The number was difficult to comprehend. Stack that many ships end to end, they'd stretch for 350 miles. Load them all with cargo at capacity, you'd have 18 million tons of material in transit, enough to supply every Allied army everywhere simultaneously. The Germans had sunk, according to the latest figures, approximately 140 Liberty ships by January 1944, 140 out of 1,800, 8%. The other 92% were completing their missions, delivering their cargo, winning the war through simple persistence. Dönitz stood and walked to the window. Outside, Berlin looked relatively normal. Some bomb damage from RAF raids, but the city functioned. Trains ran on schedule, factories produced. The German war machine continued operating at high efficiency, but efficiency meant nothing when the enemy had chosen abundance over efficiency. When the enemy accepted waste and inefficiency as the price of overwhelming production, the Americans didn't care if Liberty ships were poorly designed or if construction methods were crude. They cared about tonnage delivered, and they were delivering tonnage faster than anyone had thought possible. The final irony was that the Liberty ship program had cost less than many traditional naval programs. $2 million per ship, times 2,700 ships, $5.4 billion total. Sounds enormous until you compare it to, say, the German battleship Bismarck, which cost roughly 200 million Reichsmarks, about $80 million. The Americans had gotten 67 Liberty ships' worth of cargo capacity for the price of one German battleship. The mathematics of modern war had rendered traditional naval thinking obsolete. Battleships, beautiful and powerful though they were, represented concentrated investment vulnerable to concentrated attack. Merchant vessels, ugly and cheap though they were, represented distributed capability, resilient to any attack. You could sink 10 Liberty ships and barely dent Allied logistics. Sink one battleship and you'd eliminated a major capital unit. Dönitz turned from the window. Back to the charts, back to the reports, back to the grinding mathematics of a war that couldn't be won but had to be fought anyway, because submarines at sea needed orders, crews needed purpose, and commanders didn't have the luxury of admitting defeat while men were still willing to fight. He drafted the orders for February deployments, concentrated wolf-pack operations in the North Atlantic, target the slower convoys, avoid areas with heavy air cover, accept that losses would continue, hope for tactical victories that might, through accumulation, somehow change the strategic reality. But in his heart, Dönitz knew the truth. The Liberty ships had already won the tonnage war. Now it was just a matter of time before reality forced everyone else to acknowledge what the mathematics already showed. U-538 never made it home. On December 15, 1943, while running surfaced at night to recharge batteries, she was caught by a radar-equipped Wellington bomber from RAF Coastal Command. The aircraft dropped depth charges before the submarine could dive. Direct hit on the conning tower. The boat went down in less than 2 minutes. No survivors from the crew of 52. Captain Lieutenant Johann Heinrich Oskar was 31 years old. He'd been in the Navy since 1930. 13 years. He'd survived 3 years of submarine warfare through skill, caution, and luck. The luck ran out on a dark December night in the Bay of Biscay. The Wellington's crew reported the kill, adding U-538 to the casualty list that was growing longer each month. Another submarine lost, another 50 men dead, another statistical data point in the grinding mathematics of naval warfare. On that same day, December 15th, 1943, American shipyards launched 4 new Liberty ships. The SS Ira Nelson Morris at the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Maryland, the SS James G. Blaine at Kaiser's Richmond Yard, the SS John Hay at the California Shipbuilding Corporation in Los Angeles, the SS Marcus Daly at the Permanente Metals Corporation. 4 ships, 40,000 tons of new cargo capacity added to the Allied merchant fleet. 40,000 tons to replace the 10,000 tons Oskar had sunk over 6 weeks of patrol. The mathematics remained unchanged. For every submarine that died trying to sink ships, 4 ships entered service to replace what was lost. By the end of the war, the total would become clear. 785 U-boats lost, over 30,000 submariners killed, and their sacrifice had sunk approximately 3,000 Allied merchant vessels, totaling roughly 14 million tons. Against that, the Allies had built over 5,000 new merchant ships during the war years, over 30 million tons of new cargo capacity. The U-boats had slowed Allied logistics but never stopped them, had killed thousands but never starved Britain, had fought with desperate courage against mathematics that couldn't be overcome. The Liberty ship, ugly and ungainly and mass-produced, had won the tonnage war through the simple expedient of existing in numbers too vast to kill. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.